to Washington when, in the period, the year that I was staff philosopher to the President's Commission, Commission for Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine, and Biomedical and Behavioral Research. The first thing you did on the job was to learn the name of the thing. It took all day, but then they told me I had to have go get a business card. And in those days, certainly, academics and philosophers in particular did not have business cards. So I went to the place, and it had the presidential seal on it, you know, the fancy card. And the guy who printed them up for me when I went to pick them up thought it was a joke card. So, I still have a few extra if anybody wants to have one. So you know what the title of the talk today is, because it's right up there in front of you, and Alan told you. I'm going to use slides in medical context, which I mostly give talks these days. If you don't have slides, they just sort of leave the room. And a lot of physicians are unable to even introduce themselves to someone else without a slide to aid them. So here's what I'm going to be talking about. As Alan noted, and as probably a lot of you know if you're in Massachusetts, physician-assisted suicide, I'll use PAS. I've been chided for using physician-assisted suicide because proponents of it, of whom I count myself, like to call it physician-assisted death, because suicide has connotations for many people that are really not appropriate to the medical context. You said you wanted me to talk on assisted suicide, so that's what I'm going to do, and I'll call it that. I'll use PAS often. It's gotten a lot of public attention, not only in Massachusetts because of the referendum, but as Alan noted, there were past referenda in Washington and Oregon. Oregon was the first state. Vermont recently passed it in the legislature. Montana made it legal through a court ruling. So there's now 4 states in this country where it's illegal, and a number of countries in Europe, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland. So it's gotten a lot of public attention. And I want to start with saying it's not the most important issue in end-of-life care. I'm going to go on and advocate it, but nevertheless. Really, in end-of-life care, there are a lot of important improvements that need to be made, and that will affect a vastly larger number of patients than whether or not assisted suicide is legal or illegal. And I'm just going to start with a few examples, because if you wanted to get into end-of-life care and thought, where can I do the most good? It's not on PAS, it's on these other issues. So most dying patients express a wish to die at home. Yet in Massachusetts and many other states, probably most other states, they don't in fact die at home. And some people think that the most important advance directive you can have is do not hospitalize, because patients don't want to get there at the end of life. The dying patients only enter hospice a very short time. Hospice is a program, I assume most of you are familiar with, for patients who are considered terminally ill and expected to die within 6 months. And it's a support care service as opposed to an attempt to extend life. But most patients only enter hospice very soon before they die. And they would have benefited from it entering much earlier, but they don't. Many patients experience substantial pain and suffering near the end of life. There have been a number of studies to show that, and some of them go back a couple of decades at least. And yet, recent studies would show the same thing. It's simply, the pain in particular isn't adequately treated. In one large study, over 50% of patients were judged to suffer significant pain in the last few days of life. That's pain that can be adequately treated by physicians who know how to do it. And so there's no reason that that pain needs to be suffered. Patients also continue to get unwanted care. Back in the 70s, really, and on into the 80s, there was a hope that advance directives would, I'm really optimistic, solve the problem, but at least would reduce the extent of unwanted care that patients under experience near the end of life. And while I'm an advocate of advance directives and a fan of advance directives, I think it's fair to say that they've been a disappointment to many of their advocates. Most people still don't have them. These early advance directives were called living wills. Now they're usually called durable powers of attorney for health care or a health care proxy in Massachusetts. Many patients still don't have them. They're often not clear enough to actually help with the decisions that in fact are made. In one major study, the support study, there's another study now that calls itself a support study. So the first support study, which was a study of 10,000 dying patients, ICU patients, and they had to have been expected to die within 6 months. And there was a process of trying to get them to have advance directives. If they didn't, the process of trying to get those advance directives to the physicians that were caring for them. And then one group analyzed the actual advance directives that about 600 of those patients had, and they found that no more than a handful of them would actually be helpful in the decisions that were being made for those patients. So they're often, in particular, either too vague or too specific to be much help with the decisions, and that's not surprising because you don't know what those decisions are going to be until you get to the point. So it's still important for patients to talk with families about their wishes regarding care. That can help both guide the care in the direction the patient wants, and it can also relieve the psychological burdens that families undergo when they have to make decisions for incompetent family members. So all that's by way of background. It's to say that while I have written a lot on physician-assisted suicide and talked with it about it more times than I can count, nevertheless, if you really want to deal with improving end-of-life care, PAS should not be at the top of your list. On the other hand, that's what we're here to talk about today. So, what are the central issues about PAS? And I think there are three central ones that I'm going to talk about. One is whether it's morally different from foregoing life support. You'll see the acronyms up there. And the provision of pain relief that may hasten death. It's typically morphine. So one is it morally different from these other practices, which of course are very common in medicine? The second issue is, would legalizing PAS be ethically justified? Would it be wise public policy? A number of states, as we've already said, have done so, but Massachusetts decided not to. And third, is participation in PAS by physicians ever ethically permissible? Since many physicians believe it's incompatible with or inconsistent with the norms that should guide their practice of medicine. Now these are related issues, but they're distinct issues, and so I'll go through them one by one. A little background, a little more background already. So. In the 1980s, many doctors believed that stopping life support was illegal. I was at Brown University for many years before I wandered off to other places. And we worked in half-time, in the last 15 years that I was there, it was a half-time in medical school running the bioethics program. And I spent time in the local hospitals, particularly Rhode Island Hospital and Miriam Hospital, while I was in that role. I would hear at least once a week from some physician back in the early 80s. Well, stopping life support, for example, withdrawing the patient from a respirator, is illegal, so we can't do it. Well, that was mistaken, as I said on the slide, that was mistaken then. It remains mistaken now, but the belief was extremely common, and of course, given how common it was, it affected practice a lot. I'll briefly argue here that there's no moral difference in itself between stopping and not starting a life-sustaining treatment. And let me just give you the bare bones of an argument about that. Take a patient who has clearly stated that he doesn't want to be intubated, that is, put on a respirator in the case of respiratory failure. And he's now in respiratory failure, being brought by emergency services to the hospital. And just as he arrives, the family arrives too. They have his advance directive, and they tell the staff that he's clearly decided he did not want to be intubated. He's afraid of being not to be able to get off the respirator if he's intubated. And the staff wouldn't intubate him then, and they shouldn't, because he's rejected that treatment, and patients have rights to decide about treatment. Now suppose, so they don't start treatment with him. Suppose the family's delayed in traffic. Instead of at 2 in the afternoon, it's 5:30 in the afternoon, and they get delayed in traffic, and they arrive just after he's been intubated, and he probably would have been if there was no guidance to not do so. And so now he has to be taken off the respirator. The treatment has to be stopped. In my view, there's no significant difference between those two decisions, and no significant moral decision. He should be extubated and the treatment stopped, and it shouldn't matter that whether the fact was traffic that delayed the family in relaying his wishes. So I think there isn't a difference in and of itself between stopping and not starting treatment, and that's now widely agreed, although 30 years ago it certainly wasn't. In fact, there's often a reason for stopping that wouldn't have applied to not starting treatment. Often in end-of-life treatments, this is particularly true also of treatments of critically ill newborns, various treatments that you could apply, you're uncertain about whether they will be, in fact, beneficial to the patient. You don't know how the patient's going to do with it. So that uncertainty can give you a reason to try the treatment and see if in fact it benefits the patient. On the other hand, if you have tried it, and what you find is that it's not benefiting the patient, then you've got a reason to stop that you didn't have not to start. And actually that's an issue that used to affect the treatment of critically ill newborns a lot. Physicians, neonatal physicians were reluctant to start treatment with critically ill newborns, usually low birth weight newborns, because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to stop back in the days with people when it was hard to do so. And what that meant is that some critically ill newborns didn't get treatment that would have been beneficial to them, and that means would have saved their lives. Many physicians in this period, too, were reluctant to treat pain and suffering adequately for fear of hastening death. It was common among doctors to believe that they should never knowingly or intentionally hasten death. Now, of course, they did so. They hastened death in some cases inadvertently or even negligently in some cases, but it was believed that they shouldn't knowingly or intentionally hasten death. Morphine with patients who had become, in a sense, accustomed to it. You had to bump up the levels of morphine in order to adequately treat pain in dying patients, can sometimes hasten death. In particular, at this point, it was believed that it often did so. There's now a lot of evidence that it doesn't do so as much as people thought. But but nevertheless, sometimes it still does so. And so adequately treating pain came into conflict with this view that you shouldn't hasten death. And finally, participating in PAS, or even more so in voluntary euthanasia, seemed clearly to hasten death, and so physicians didn't want to take part in it. So all that is the background. Now, let's get to the foreground. Let's look at that first issue. Is PAS importantly different morally from foregoing life support and pain relief that hastens death? I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give my own views on a number of these issues. Not everybody shares my view, and I'm sure not everybody here does. But I'll give you the arguments for the views. In foregoing life support, whether stopping or not stopping, it's commonly believed that the physician's intent is to respect the patient's wishes about treatment. The intent is not to end their lives. And that's the way physicians think of what they're doing and what their intent is. I think that's often the case, and should be the case. But in foregoing life support, sometimes both the patient and the physician want and intend the patient's death. A patient may say, I don't want to continue in this way anymore with the treatments I'm getting. I want to die. The way I can do that is to stop life-sustaining treatment that I'm receiving. And I want you to do so, speaking to the physician. The physician believes that this is in the patient's interest and would be better for the patient because the life is intolerable to the patient with the treatment. So I think it's reasonable to say, intention is tricky here, but it's reasonable to say that at least sometimes the intent is of both patient and physician to hasten death. In pain relief treatments like morphine and others, the common view is that the intention is to relieve pain. And if there's a hastened death as a result of that, nevertheless, that's not an intended consequence of what's done. That's as it's usually put, a foreseen consequence, but an unintended consequence. Not something that, to put it loosely, is wanted. Now, sometimes an earlier death is not seen by either the patient or the physician as a bad thing, as an evil. Sometimes, of course, it's welcomed by the patient, the family, the physician. All of them believe that it would be a good thing for that to happen, and the way they're bringing it about is to use pain relief, which will hasten death. Now, I think actually that's, in my view, not the right moral issue. Physicians are not morally and legally responsible only for what they intend. They could get off the hook of a lot of things if that was true. What they are legally and morally responsible for are the foreseeable consequences of their actions. Not just the foreseen ones, the ones they haven't foreseen, but they can be held responsible for the foreseeable consequences of their actions, just like all of us can in driving a car. If there are foreseeable consequences of what you're doing and you do it anyway and harms result, you'll be responsible for those harms even if you weren't intending to bring those harms about. So the question should be, in my view, not was the earlier death intended, but has the patient consented to the risk of an earlier death in order to have his or her pain adequately treated and relieved. In some cases, of course, relief of pain and suffering is also the aim of assisted suicide. That's how the patient gets out of the circumstances that he or she is in, which involve significant pain and suffering. the last point about this is that in PAS, the physician's intent often is not to contribute to the patient ending his or her life. There are famous articles now about everything I know is 10 or 20 years ago or more, but famous articles by Dr. Tim Quill in the New England Journal of Medicine about a patient of his whose name was Diane, and he gave her the means to end her life. He didn't intend her to do so. He didn't expect her to do so. What he wanted to do was to relieve her anxiety about what the end of her life would be like, and to give her the means to control what that period would be like. Give her the means to end her life if she found her condition intolerable. And that's often the case. That is, if you look at data in Oregon where assisted suicide is legal and has been for now, I guess 15 years at least, maybe more, often pills that are prescribed and prescription is filled by the patient are never used. And the intent is to relieve the anxiety that a patient is suffering about what his or her end period will be like. So the intent in PAS is not always to end life. It's often to give the patient a sense of control over what will happen. Well, moving right along, is PAS always morally wrong because it's the deliberate killing of an innocent human being? That's particularly important when I'm within the School of Theology to note this, because in Catholic moral theology, the deliberate killing of an innocent human being is always morally permissible. Now, I'm not an expert on moral theology, and so I say that with caution in these contexts, but I think it's true. And the consent of the victim, in this case the patient, doesn't make doing it morally permissible. So the way to understand, I think, within that particular moral framework, when a patient asks a physician for assisted suicide or even voluntary euthanasia, is that the patient is asking the physician to do evil, to do what's wrong, which is to deliberately take the life of an innocent person. Now, I think, here again, you're going to get my view, inadequately argued for, but I'll do my best. I think this is a mistaken view of the moral wrongness of killing. It focuses only on the agent, telling the agent never to deliberately take the life of an innocent person. And it doesn't take account of the victim, namely the person whose life would be taken. So let me ask the question, why are paradigm cases of wrongful killing wrongful? I don't have any guns, and I never have, except briefly when I was in the Army, and I had to have one many years ago. But if I had a gun, I pulled it out and I shot one of you. That would be a paradigm case of wrongful killing. Why is it wrongful killing? Well, in two ways, I think. It harms whoever it is I shoot, the victim. How does it do that? It takes away their future, which they value and which would other things either be, none of you look like you're terminally ill and about to die, so you would have a good future ahead of you. And I would be harming you by taking that away. I would also be wronging you, and I would make a distinction between these here, by taking what's rightfully yours, namely your life, without your consent. And that, in my view, is in sort of the simplest terms, a different account of when and why killing is wrong, when it harms the victim and wrongs the victim. Now, if that's a plausible account of the wrongfulness of killing, then that doesn't make PAS wrongful, because it's plausible to think that when persons ask for assisted suicide, the means to engage in it, they've decided that their future is no longer valuable to them. I'm assuming we're talking about competent patients here. Take that up in discussion if you wish. And they've also consented to the physician provide them with the means to do that. So it looks as if, to me, patients who ask for assisted suicide and a physician grants it are neither harmed nor wronged. And so the typical reasons for killing being wrong don't apply in this case. People have a moral right not to be killed, and asking for PAS in effect waives that right. So in this case, it's like, you have a right to control the use of your car. And some friend asked you to, if you can use your car, and you say, well, okay, if you're using it tomorrow, and here are the keys, and that person waives their right to the property ownership of their car, that waives the right to control its use, gives it to you the next day. So in this account, PAS does not violate a patient's right not to be killed. Again, we're talking about competent patients, and all the states that have legalized assisted suicide have had a requirement of competence in the patient's account. Okay, here's another controversial question. Does PAS, but not foregoing life support, involve the patient in killing? Now here you're going to see my view is distinctly controversial. In PAS, of course, the patient kills him or herself. The physician just provides the means, writes a prescription for you to get whatever the particular medication is to be used by the patient to take his or her life. In foregoing life support, the standard view, the conventional view, is that the physician doesn't kill. The physician only allows the patient to die. And allowing to die is commonly considered less seriously wrong than killing. And so what the physician does is not the seriously wrong thing, namely killing. It's allowing to die, which is considered not wrong in the circumstances in which the patient says, I want their treatment withdrawn, and so forth and so on. I think both of these views are mistaken. Take the case of a competent patient who asked to be removed from a life-sustaining respirator. So she has chronic and serious COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. They have tried to wean her from the respirator. They haven't succeeded. And so she's going to be stuck on that respirator the rest of her life. And she has, let's assume she has other kinds of difficulty. And so the physician says, okay, you're entitled to decide about treatment, and we'll remove the respirator in the morning. Some of you may have read my account of this case, but so the patient has a greedy nephew. He's afraid he's the only family member. He's afraid he's going to lose his inheritance in a long hospitalization. He doesn't know that the patient has decided to stop treatment. And so that evening, he comes into her room, and he turns off the respirator, pulls the tube out, and the patient dies. And suppose the staff catches him. And what likely they would say, what have you done? And he says, well, I didn't kill her. I merely allowed her to die. Now, if you're with me, I put it in big bold. It's the biggest and boldest type in the slides. This would be specious nonsense. What he did was to go in and deliberately kill him. And he did it by stopping her treatment. But that was exactly what the physician was going to do the next morning, of course. He was going to perform the very same actions. If so, if we're convinced that what he does is to kill his aunt, and perhaps what the physician does would also have been to kill the patient. But there are important moral differences between the two. What are some of them? Here are three. The physician would have had the consent of the patient to stop the respirator. The greedy nephew certainly didn't. The physician was acting from a good motive to respect his patient's wishes. The nephew was acting from a bad motive to protect his inheritance. And the physician is in a social role, social and legal role, where he's entitled to act in this way. The greedy nephew certainly is not in any social role where he's entitled to act in this way. Now, these are all important moral differences between what the greedy nephew does and what the physician would have done the next morning. But none of these, I think, are differences affecting whether what is done is killing or allowing to die. After all, you can allow someone to die without their consent. You can allow someone to die with a bad motive, and so forth and so on. So those are separate issues, and whether it is consent and so forth. Those other issues make what the nephew does, all things considered, seriously wrong, and they would make what the physician does not wrong at all. It's part of his responsibility in caring for his patient and respecting her wishes. As I say, that's not the conventional view, I hope you noticed. What are the sources of resistance to this idea that physicians kill their patients? In some cases, intentionally, but justifiably, morally justifiably. Well, here's one brief account of that. Many physicians believe that killing is unjustified causing death. They take it to be, with these equal, wrongful. But they also believe that foregoing life support is justified. In fact, patients are entitled to do so. So if they have those two beliefs, then foregoing life support must be allowing to die, not killing. Because they would be, those beliefs would be incompatible if what foregoing life support amounted to was killing. Then wouldn't be justified. Now, an alternative view here is just that some killing is justified. And we already believe that. Killing in self-defense is widely believed to be justified. So it's not the case that we believe that all killing, even intentional killing, is wrong. It may be that this is another place where it's morally justified. Here's another source of the resistance of physicians to this account. They like to say something like the following: that they interpret stopping life support, what the physician would have done the next morning with that patient, of extubating her, and she would have died probably within 15 minutes, as merely allowing to die. And notice how naturally the merely fits in there. I didn't kill her, I merely allowed her to die. What's going on there psychologically? I think what's going on there is it's a way of physician distancing him or herself from the death. So the usual view is that the physician isn't the cause of death. What goes on the death certificate is not physician pulled the tube and killed the patient. What goes on the death certificate is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from which the patient died when she no longer had the respirator support. And a lot of other language that's common in this end-of-life context has this function of distancing those who are acting from the felt consequences and responsibility for what happened. So think of I've got two others on the list. I'm here for more. That was all the room there was on the slide. So we're merely letting nature take its course. Nature's responsible for what's happening, not us. We stop prolonging the dying process. It's the dying process that's responsible for what's happening, not us. Now, I and a couple of other co-authors tried to characterize what's going on here. There are moral fictions at work here. Moral fictions, as we characterize them, are motivated false beliefs. We endorse them in order to maintain, excuse me, we endorse them in order to maintain other beliefs that are thought to be important. What are the other beliefs? Doctors don't deliberately cause death. Doctors don't deliberately kill patients. Well, if we have those beliefs, then we're going to have some other moral fictions, I think. We're going to have to think that in stopping the aunt's respirator, which both the nephew and the doctor do, and cause her death in the ordinary sense of causing it. They perform an action that causes her to die in a way and at a time when she otherwise wouldn't have. That's a sort of simple notion of causality which is at work there. So it looks like they do cause death. And if the nephew kills, it looks like the doctor, who would have done the same thing the next morning, does so in those cases when he does do that the next morning. So it's, the idea of moral fictions is, and actually there are lots of moral fictions in the law, if you look around it, but in this context, you can understand why people have these false beliefs, because it allows them to maintain other beliefs that are important. These beliefs that doctors don't deliberately cause death. These beliefs that doctors don't deliberately kill their patient. Well, they're going to have to interpret what goes on in a way that looks like a moral fiction in order to maintain those beliefs and at the same time say that it's fine for doctors to stop life support when patients ask them to do so. Okay, second major issue, this will go quicker. With legalizing PASD, good public policy, ethically justified public policy. Now, I'm going to ask that question in the context where we say, well, every individual case of PAS wouldn't be wrong simply because the patient ends up dead. And there's two kinds of reasonable disagreement here. There's reasonable disagreement about what would be the consequences of such a public policy. And there's reasonable disagreement about the moral importance of those different consequences.